Vikings, also called Norsemen or Danes, were a population from today's Denmark, Norway and Sweden. Their homeland was extremely rural. They lived on agriculture, fishing and raiding. Vikings raided and traded across the whole continent from the 8th to the 11th century, seeking fortune and fame. The history of the Vikings is closely linked to their role as masters of the sea. They were feared as fierce and ruthless pirates. But there were also poets, lawmakers and great artists. Even the Vikings' reputation, they lived in a well-ordered society based on laws and democracy. The Viking society was divided into three socio-economic classes: thralls, carls and jarls. The jarls were wealthy and owned large estates with huge long houses, horses and many thralls who did most of the daily chores. When a jarl died, he was buried. His household thralls were sometimes sacrificed and buried next to him. Thralls were the lowest ranking class and they were slaves. Slavery was of vital importance to Viking society for everyday chores and large-scale construction, and also to trade and economy. The Vikings often captured many people on their raids in Europe to enslave them and brought back home to Scandinavia by boat. Carls were free peasants. They owned farms, land and cattle, and were engaged in daily chores like plowing the fields, making the cattle, building houses and raiding. Women had a sort of a free status in the Nordic countries. Widows enjoyed the same independent status as a married woman. A woman could divorce her husband and remarry. A free woman could also cohabit with a man and have children with him without marrying him, even if that man was married. In fact, there was no distinction made between children born inside or outside the marriage. Women had religious authority as priestesses and oracles. They were active as poets and rune masters, and they also have been often active in military office. Loot and glory were not the only motivation for raids. Land to farm was also a debatable commodity. Land to farm was also a desirable commodity, especially for the families along the western seaboard of Norway, where fertile land was in short supply. Younger sons, political exiles, mercenary warriors, and traders all had the option of becoming colonists. Once based in Scotland, they could farm and trade until turned their hand to raiding whenever convenient. Then they brought slaves and a lot of raw material from Ireland. The colonization of England was more complicated. It became a big war against the Anglo-Saxons, started with the sack of Lindisfarne. Norwegian Vikings settled in Iceland after 770, and in the 10th century discovered Greenland. In the Frankish areas, they traded weapons, glass, ceramics, jewelry and wine. The Northmen also sailed down past Spain and into the Mediterranean. Evidence that the Vikings were there includes graffiti runes in the Hagia Sophia church. The runes are illegible except for the name Halfdan. In Istanbul, they worked as hired hands for the ruling class and for the basileus himself. The Vikings also took precious materials from the territories around the Caspian Sea. And most importantly, the Vikings reached North America about 986, 5 centuries before Columbus. The frequent and successful adventures overseas required good and fast ships. The evolution of naval architecture is very slow. It develops by degrees over nearly 1,000 years. We know how Vikings' ships looked like because many Northmen were buried with their worldly goods, and sometimes this included their boat. The Gokstad ship from a burial south of Oslo is the sort of warship to which Viking raiders aspired. An elegant 23 meters of curving oak plank ship built in the 9th century. Few warlords could afford to send such a magnificent vessel to the grave. The Vikings were very violent people. They thought violence was the only way to defend their honor. The Norsemen had no professional standing army. Tactics and discipline seem to have been fairly basic. They didn't fight in regular formations, in spite of the bonds of loyalty between men and their lords. Weapons training began in youth in hunting, sports and raiding. In preparation for battle, the younger warriors would draw up in line, with their shields overlapping in a shield wall for better protection. Their chiefs were well defended by a close bodyguard. Battle then began by throwing a spear over the enemy line. They used ground weapons such as axes and swords. The Vikings were specialized in raids, usually on coastal regions. Their first recorded raid was the attack at the Lindisfarne Monastery in northern England in 793. They destroyed manuscripts, enslaved monks, and stole treasures. The raid shocked the Christian world because of the Vikings' disrespect for religious institutions. The Danes didn't disappear, they simply stopped raiding. At the beginning of the Viking Age, Norse society tended to be egalitarian, with a large number of free, land-owning farmers who had all engaged in raiding. But in the end of the Viking Age, this balance had changed. There were a small number of privileged and a much larger number of landless men who worked in order to pay their rents and were not allowed to go raiding. So the number of raiders became less and less. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 is used as a convenient marker for the end of the Viking Age, because it was the last major Viking incursion to England, organized by King Harold.
Viking religion was pagan and polytheistic. The people established close relations with their gods. They needed them and so came to terms with them. They assisted the king in keeping the peace and smile upon the harvests. The devotees were faithful in their worship but expected results in return. The rites of the cult were very much part of the routine of daily life. They believed that the gods reside at Asgard, a fortress in the center of which flourished an evergreen ash tree called the Jasgastrill, whose roots reached down to the underworld. They didn't have a sacred building or sacred place, but ceremonies were celebrated in the open. The central religious rite was the sacrificial offering. The Vikings sacrificed not only beasts but also humans. The victim was killed with a sword or axe. Blood was collected into a sacred vessel. These ritual deaths were followed by a feast, which began with solemn liberations offered to the gods. In Viking society there weren't professional priests, the chieftain was also a priest. Odin was the god who dominated all the others. He was the god of knowledge and of war and victory. He was escorted by two ravens, Hugging and Munning. The name of the fourth day of the week, Wednesday, comes from Wednesday, the god's old English name. Odin was married to Frigg, the guardian of marriage. Odin spanned the history of the Norse mythic from its creation to its destruction. Before the world existed, he and his two younger brothers, Vili and Vei, killed the primal frost giant. Tyr is a god associated with law and heroic glory in Norse mythology. Tyr is portrayed alternately as the son of Odin or of Ymir. Thor was the son of Odin, and his name means thunder because when he wanted to ride across the sky in a chariot pulled by two he-goats, it produced a noise like the roaring of a storm. Thor brandished a hammer, Mjolnir, symbol of lightning, and only him could lift the hammer. He protected the world of men from giants, little furry spirits, from cold and from hunger. He was almost human in character, violent but benevolent. He was the most popular god. Frey, good and generous to a fault, was the god of fertility. His sister Freya, goddess of beauty, reigned over the army of the Valkyries. Frey is a widely attested god associated with sacred kingship, virility and prosperity, with sunshine and fair weather, and pictured as a phallic fertility god in Norse mythology. Freyr is one of the Vanir, son of the god of sea and the twin brother of the goddess Freya. The Viking universe was made up of several worlds. It was dominated by Asgard, house of the Aesir, and its heart was Midgard, which is the world of man. In an outer ring lived the divine beings. The Edda is a group of poems written in the 14th century by Snorri Sturluson. It's one of the great figures of medieval European literature. The Poetic and Prose Eddas are a manual of poetics which contains many mythologic stories. Its purpose is to enable Icelandic poets and readers to understand the subtleties of alliterative verse and to grasp the mythological allusion behind the many keynames that were used in Akkadic poetry that were transmitted by word of mouth from one generation to the other.